Well, a very good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this press conference with the International Commission of Human Rights on Ethiopia. The three members of the Commission, Ms. Betty Murungi, Mr. Stephen Ratner, and Ms. Radhika Kumaraswamy, are here with us. Just to note that the Commission presented its first report to the Human Rights Council this morning. There is a continuing interactive discussion which will commence in about 1 hour from now. The Commissioners want to take this opportunity to meet with you, members of the press. I should just mention that the Commission itself was established by the Human Rights Council last December 2021. The Commissioners were appointed by the President of the Council in March. Ms. Kumaraswamy's appointment came a few months after that. So again, they want to take this opportunity to meet with you. So opening remarks from the Chairperson, Ms. Murungi, and then over to you for your questions. Betty, go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you, members of the press, for meeting with us. We made our presentation to the Human Rights Council this morning, and as you're aware, this would be our first report, our initial report to the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in Ethiopia. We are concerned as a Commission that after 5 months of what was often quite a tense ceasefire, that hostilities resumed late last month between the federal government and its allies and the forces backing the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. The fighting seems to be escalating, and we have received credible information that there is an escalation in drone attacks, which are employing explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We reported that the suspension of UN humanitarian access into Tigray that happened in late August 2022 is of great concern, as well as reports of involvement by Eritrean forces along the border. We are horrified that this renewed hostilities between the warring parties has now placed the population in a very tenuous situation. The consequences of this renewed war has potential to affect not just the stability of Ethiopia, but of the entire Horn of Africa region. In short, let me just give you a summary of what our investigations covered. We conducted an in-depth investigation into 3 selected incidents and 2 thematic areas. The incidents examined were the shelling of Mekelle on 28 November 2020 and subsequent attacks on civilians and civilian objects. 2, the killings in Kobo and Chena in late August and early September 2021. And 3, a drone strike on a camp for internally displaced persons in Dedebit on 7th January 2022. We examined the themes of rape and sexual violence and the denial and obstruction of humanitarian aid and access. We interviewed during our investigation 185 victims, who included survivors, witnesses, and other key interlocutors. 104 of these were women, and 81 were men and boys. We did not get access into Ethiopia, although we had initial meetings with Government of Ethiopia authorities in late July in Addis Ababa. We were not granted the access to the sites of the incidents that we have spoken about. Our report underscores the dire humanitarian situation in the Tigray region, where the federal government and its allies have denied some 6 million people access to basic services, which include electricity, internet, telecommunications, and banking for over 1 year. We reported that we have reasonable grounds to believe that the federal government and its allies have looted and destroyed goods indispensable for the survival of the civilian population in Tigray by killing livestock, destroying food stores, and raising crops, while also implementing severe restrictions on humanitarian access to Tigray. Most of the population in Tigray must now survive on limited and nutritionally inadequate diets. We also received reports from sources that there is an increase in child marriages and child labor, human trafficking, and transactional sex, which are now being employed as desperate means of survival by people in that region. We have reasonable grounds to believe that the widespread denial and obstruction of access to basic services, food, healthcare, and humanitarian assistance amounts to the crimes against humanity of persecution and inhumane acts. We also have reasonable grounds to believe that the federal government is committing the war crime of using starvation as a method of warfare. We also received information that Tigrayan forces have looted and otherwise misappropriated humanitarian aid. In addition to the investigations and findings we made on the crimes we have reasonable grounds to believe were committed by Ethiopian Air Force, including intentionally directing attacks at civilians in the airstrike over the displaced persons camp in Dedebet with an armed drone in January 2022, that killed around 60 civilians. We also made findings relating to really barbaric attacks by use of rape and other acts of sexual violence that was committed by parties to the conflict that include the ENDF, which is the Ethiopian military forces, but also the forces, the Tigray forces. We found reasonable grounds to believe that Tigrayan forces committed other serious human rights abuses in addition to the crimes of sexual violence and rape. But the large-scale killings of Amhara civilians and the use of dehumanizing language by all parties to the conflict is a matter that we have put quite a bit of emphasis on in our report. We are alive to the fact that the Ethiopian government has initiated domestic responses and mechanisms to respond to the report that was issued by a joint investigation team that was set up after the cessation of hostilities in June 2021, before this new round of hostilities. And this joint investigation team made certain recommendations which are being implemented by the Interministerial Task Force of the Government of Ethiopia. Our mandate requires us to offer guidance and advise to this body on transitional justice. However, we have not gotten to that point yet, and with the renewed hostilities, we have not been able to offer any such advice to the Interministerial Task Force. We would like to also observe that we are very supportive of the Africa-led peace process that is currently being initiated by the Africa Union and led by the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, former President Obasanjo. And we are yet to see, we are hopeful that this peace process will result in peace for Ethiopia and certainly, bring an end to what we are now seeing. We do not believe that there is a military solution to this conflict. We are therefore hopeful that this peace process will bear dividends. We are happy to take your questions. We are aware that you have seen our report and you have read it, and you may have specific questions for us, and we're happy to respond to those questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betty. And just to remind you that the report itself is online, which is 3 annexes. The press release for the report was actually sent out on Tuesday, and the statement delivered by Ms. Murungi was shared with you earlier. So over to you for your questions. Nick Cumming-Bruce of the New York Times in the room.
Thank you. The summary of the report says, it lists a lot of crimes and abuses, and it then talks about war crimes and crimes against humanity. But these are different categories of crime. So I wonder, it doesn't actually say in the report who has committed crimes against humanity. Could we be explicit on who you think has committed crimes against humanity? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. We actually do make findings regarding which parties committed which crimes. So in the sort of the section that's called legal conclusions, we identify which party violated the human rights, which violated the humanitarian law, and which parties committed either war crimes or crimes against humanity. So it really depends on, each episode is different, but there were obviously the violations concerning the Mekele were by the ENDF. The violations concerning the Dedabit attack were also by the ENDF. The Eritreans have committed violations, and then of course the Tigrayan forces with respect to Chena and Kobo, and then with respect to the rapes and sexual violence, again we identify which parties committed them. So we didn't shirk from that identification of which parties, although we didn't have the time to get into a question of individuals.
Thank you. We have a question from Laurent Sierra online from a Swiss news agency, if we can unmute.
So is it working today, Rolando?
It's working perfect. I can hear you loud and clear. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for the other day. Thanks for the briefing, for the press conference. 2 questions. The first one, so you mentioned in several instances in the report the EDF, the Eritrean forces, and the U.S. Special Envoy 2 days ago said that they are clearly inflaming the conflict. So what do you think withdrawal from these forces from the area along the border would change in that conflict? And secondly, this morning, the Ethiopian representative once again rejected the report and said that you go beyond your mandate, and he seems to play the joint team, the efforts and the response of the government to the joint team report against your work. What's your reaction to that? Thank you.
Thank you. With regard to our report, does find violations by the Eritrean forces very clearly, and does mark them out. All the crimes of rape and sexual violence, especially, were outlined in the report as being particularly egregious, but also killings. So I think that their violations have been covered in the report, and their involvement in the war is something that is disturbing. We have pushed at all levels for the peace process. We have made statements asking for the peace process to succeed, because we believe that there's a causal link between peace and the prevention of human rights violations. So we truly hope that whether it's the Eritreans or the Ethiopians or the Tigray forces, that the special envoy will be successful and be able to restore peace. With regard to the second question, the Ethiopian government rejected our report because they felt we went beyond our mandate. But I must say that we had very constructive discussions with the JIT, and we hope to work with them again. They in fact sent us just after our report was published, a framework for cooperation, which we will look at. But we do feel that it is necessary that there be an external, independent and impartial investigation of these crimes, and that there can be a constructive dialogue between the JIT and us, but there are sometimes areas where we may go do investigations in areas where they have also investigated. One of them we have in our report in Mekelle, because we had additional information to what they had, and therefore we felt that it was necessary to go into that again. So I think we will continue to have, hopefully, a constructive and dialogue with them. But we do not feel that that should mean that our mandate should be limited, and our impartiality investigation, and the importance of external scrutiny in a situation where there is no witnesses to a war really leads to atrocity crimes. And we are very aware that if this peace process fails, that there will be atrocity crimes in Ethiopia, which we will not be able to stop. So we see our work as both a tool of justice and a tool of prevention.
Thank you. Emma Farage in the room. Emma Farage of Reuters.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you get into the politics of this, but I wanted to ask a question about the renewal of your mandate. I understand it was a very tight vote last time, and I'm wondering how worried you are about your mandate not being renewed. Why do you think the opposition was there? Is it still there? Is there any campaigning against a renewal of your mandate? And what would be the consequences of your work not being renewed? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question. Like yourself, we don't actually get involved in the conversations or discussions around renewal of our mandate. That is for the Human Rights Council members to get into. We are aware that obviously, and we have heard even on the floor of the Human Rights Council this morning, that there are a considerable number of states that do not support country-specific mandates. And we'll be obviously we're available to continue with the work that we have been provided, but at this moment our mandate expires in December, and we will be waiting to hear what the members of the council decide to do with the discussions around renewal of the mandate.
Thank you. We have another question from Laurent Siro of Swiss News Agency. Go ahead.
Yeah, since my mic is working, I go on. When you say that since the resumption of hostilities, there seems to be an escalation, does that mean that the statements by the TPLF, where they say that they are ready to engage in that process under the auspices of AU, does that mean that there hasn't been any change in terms of violations on the ground since that statement? Thank you.
I think the short answer to that question is that we are not independently able to verify exactly what the scale is right now. We know that things have certainly gotten worse since the resumption of hostilities. I mean, that's obvious because there was this truce in which certain of the worst violations were not happening, although the denial of humanitarian access was happening despite the truce. But in terms of what's happening on a day-to-day basis and whether any of that has changed in recent days, as the parties have talked about renewal of peace talks, we don't have the resources or the information on the ground to know, in part due to the telecommunications blackout in Tigray.
Thank you, Stephen. Do we have any further questions? Nick, New York Times, go ahead. 1 second for the microphone.
Yeah, in relation to the sexual violence that you detail, I'm wondering to what extent this was more than just the work of lawless troops or troops acting sort of on an ad hoc sort of wild basis, whether you felt there was something much more systematic and organized about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, in the sense that I think there was very wide-scale, really what we say staggering levels of sexual violence in the Ethiopian conflict. We cannot, we had a standard of reasonable standard of belief. There were there were some cases where people said that when they were being raped, there was a certain intentionality there about destroying an ethnicity. But there were a few cases, and not enough for us to think that it was either systematic or something at a level that met our standard in which we would report it. But there were a few isolated cases where that was mentioned.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Do we have any further questions in the room or online? Okay, Nick, back to you.
I was struck in the report by the difficulty you had getting support and access to information from other organizations, initially the JIT, but also from within UN agencies. And I wondered if you would like to elaborate on that a little bit and what you think was behind it, and how come UN organizations were not supportive fully of a UN-mandated inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. As you're aware, the resolution mandated us to build upon the work of the JIT, and the JIT consisted of the two partners, OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. They had initial concerns, obviously, in sharing their database with us, which is what we had requested, so that we would be able to determine which of the incidents that they had investigated, but on which they hadn't made any findings, that we could ourselves investigate. The idea was that we do not duplicate what they had done. Rather, we should build upon and also be supportive of the implementation of the recommendations that they had made, which had been accepted by the government of Ethiopia and which they were implementing through various mechanisms. Key of those was the Interministerial Task Force. So there was some delays, and by the time we were issuing our report, we had not yet received indication from the JIT that they would in fact be willing to share with us their database. But we have since then received a proposed framework which we are responding to, and which we are very excited that they have come to this decision that they would grant us access to their database, obviously on conditions that they have proposed that protect the witnesses and that are done in accordance with the standards that are acceptable in terms of sharing that kind of information, which obviously is very sensitive, given that there is still conflict that is ongoing. So that is the context in which we made that statement in our report. We are aware that organizations have become very careful in terms of sharing information, and we understood this to be within the context of protecting witnesses in a context of conflict, or in the kind of fragile context that still required a lot of ensuring that victims who were still in need of humanitarian support, for example, would be able to get that support without exposing them to any further danger. So that's the context, and we're hopeful that we will be able to obtain this database as we go along.
Thank you. Unless follow-up, Nick? No?
Well,
You okay?
just to say that, I mean, you talked about delays in the responses of UN country agencies, and I'm wondering to what extent that impeded your work, and does your reference to concerns about ensuring access to humanitarian assistance cover those delays, or was there something else going on there?
There wasn't anything else going on. I think UN agencies have developed protocols, I think, in which now they use to share information with mechanisms such as ours. And so, of course, for us, because we didn't have access to the locations, it's important for us to be able to work collaboratively and closely with UN agencies to obtain the kind of information we're seeking. We are also obviously seeking to interview between now and when our mandate expires, to interview refugees in neighboring countries. For that respect, we would need the support and collaboration of UN agencies that obviously are running, the refugee camps and so on. So it was not intended as to say that we did not get any support, but that rather we look forward to getting even closer cooperation from these agencies.
Thank you, Betty. Anybody else? Questions online or in person? No? Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for taking this opportunity. Good luck with the remaining interactive discussions this afternoon, and thank you all very much for following the activities of the Commission. Have a good afternoon.